My name is Judit Bodor, and first I think I would just like to thank Interface for inviting me and Artpool here in this project, and especially Júlia and also for the library to host this event today. And another thing that I would like to say is that currently there is an exhibition which I think most of you already seen, or if not, then can go and see in the next 2 weeks, I think, in the switch room. Exhibitions of archives, and Artpool is there with an exhibition and showing of works from the 70s and 80s and 90s as well, and then you can find information about Artpool, leaflets and documents. And at last but not least, I would also like to introduce you to Júlia, just behind the camera there, who is actually the co-founder of Artpool Archive, and currently the administrative director of Artpool Art Research Center in Budapest, and hopefully she will also take part in the panel discussion later. So as I said, my name is Judit Bodor, and I'm an art historian, a writer and a curator. Probably depends on what kind of projects I'm working on. I'm currently based at the Artpool College of Arts in Devon in the UK, in England. But before that, I was involved as a researcher and an art historian in the project of Artpool Art Research Center between 1999 and 2004. Just to answer to the first idea of this whole project, I have to confess that I was there, but at Artpool, but not when it was established in 1979. I was there much later. And therefore my presentation here today is more of an attempt to critically discuss and locate the Artpool project in particular, rather than a confession of someone who was originally involved. In that sense, it's less of a storytelling than it is an analysis, as opposite to Nick's role. Artpool Art Research Center today is a non-profit organization in Budapest, Hungary. It includes a public library and a multimedia archives, an exhibition space called Artpool P60, and a website dedicated to research and used as probably the most important tool for wider dissemination. The website, the address of the website will come on a loop, so you can see that, and it's actually a bilingual website, which is in English and in Hungarian, so you can see and read about Artpool. Established by artists Klaniczay and Júlia in 1979, Artpool collects, circulates and generates information about current and progressive trends in art from the 1960s onwards. On first glance, Artpool is an avant-garde archive in as much as it deals mostly with material concerning the 20th century avant-garde in art. Artpool is clearly not the only such organization. There are many institutions in the world, some big and some small, which collect material representing strategies of the avant-garde activism since the 1960s. Collecting and making such material accessible, whilst laudable and necessary, is not in itself to be considered in any way radical. Artpool, however, is a distinctive model of practice in the art archival field. The artist Klaniczay founded it as an active archive, an institution that is simultaneously the material and the subject of the artistic practice, employing archival processes in complex art projects, where documents and discourse are collected, circulated and generated through the organization of information. In this presentation, I would like to talk about the avant-garde archive, not only in the sense of an archive of the avant-garde that collects, receives and stores material about the avant-garde, but an avant-garde archive in the sense of the active archive as conceived by Klaniczay, the artist, as a matrix generating avant-garde production and reproduction. Unlike the institutionalized reliquary then, this archive is avant-garde in both its conception and its operation. It also exists to document its own activities over the course of the existence of the 3 decades. I will set out to make such distinctions by first outlining some principles of art archiving in the context of Eastern Europe, knowledge of which emerged directly from my experience in Artpool, as a context in which to chart the historical and critical development of the organization of the research center. This will allow in turn the explanation of Klaniczay's key concept of active archive. Continuing to remark on Artpool's importance as a model in the art archival field, I will also look to identify some of the questions that Artpool as a unique institution itself faces as its future, including how it will continue and be understood in future generations. My interest in general lies in the histories and theories of contemporary art, as well as the means by which these histories and theories are constructed, archived and disseminated through models of archival and curatorial practices. This means naturally that I have had to become engaged in broader understanding of the cultural and intellectual function of archiving in general and art archiving specifically. In this context, we understand, however, that while discourses of institutionalism and psychologies of the subconscious has provided a basis for post-structuralist or postmodern theorizing of archiving, these seem somehow often too abstract to connect the archival impulse with practical knowledge. Conversely, however, the avant-garde archive as a strategy in practice directly enacts formation of artistic practice that contributes in the present to ongoing knowledge economies. Archives more generally have remits that determine respective scopes of collection, remits that determine as much what each excludes as much as what each includes. Naturally, this is common to both avant-garde and mainstream archives, as each equally embarks upon selection, and in this respect on constructing particular histories, whether personal, social, cultural, political. There is yet an important difference insofar as the avant-garde archive often exists to deal expressly with that which is commonly excluded because of the mainstream archive's policies and strategies that determine that which is or should be commonly included. Material can more easily fall into the category of the commonly excluded if either its aesthetic or cultural value is problematic, or its state of materiality or form requires too individual or idiosyncratic, specific and archival strategy. For example, in general or in kind of historical terms, a mainstream archiving relies on keeping records, paper-based documents relating to the making of an artwork or to social activities, while avant-garde archiving blurs this distinction between the artworks and the documents creatively and critically in terms of dealing with an ephemera. For example, the documents themselves might become the artworks, or the documents are the only remaining residues or traces about an artwork that doesn't exist anymore. So, in this sense, avant-garde archives as a separate, it can be understood as a separate form of an art institution that is a result of the necessity due to the changes that are happening in contemporary art largely since the 1960s. These changes reflect on how documentation itself comes to provide a context and medium for ephemeral art, and thus require different art archiving strategies in respect of the object of the art. This, along with the changing relationship between museums and galleries and the new avant-garde art from the 1960s, resulted in the birth of the avant-garde archive as an alternative way of preserving and circulating information about progressive trends in art. As such, one of the common features of the avant-garde archives today is that they reflect the networking strategies and tactics of the time they were created through documentation of works and ephemera, like mail art works, like semi-sub publications, conceptual works, performance art documents or traces, and so on. But even amongst avant-garde archives, further difference emerges when considering the geographical, political, or economic context of the avant-garde archives in Western Europe and in the US, in comparison to the post-World War II Eastern Europe. The difference is simply that entitlement to civil liberties in the West was not present in the East. Of course, while one could debate the extent to which recourse to civil liberties guarantees freedom any more in liberal democratic than authoritarian socialist societies, we have to be mindful of facts such as that when the Klaniczay set up Artpool, at that time, the right to publish was reserved by and for the authorities. Private individuals had great difficulties with publishing anything else than visiting cards or wedding invitations up until the mid-80s. Permission was needed to place an order at the printing house, and no copy machines were available to the public. Strategies of self-documentation, that is to say, samizdat publications, and involvement in the black market was necessary to be able to print or copy any material. Furthermore, communication and networking itself was censored, as mail was opened as a matter of routine, and it was very difficult to travel and meet other artists or to hold exhibitions. Therefore, while in the West, avant-garde artists at least had the theoretical possibility of building networks, traveling and holding exhibitions if desired, or if they had got the money, in Hungary and in other countries within the Eastern Bloc, the avant-garde had no legal entitlement to communication and explicit presence in any public domain. And these questions for me seem very, very important questions to compare what, for example, Art and Research Exchange could or couldn't achieve in terms of the Northern Irish context. For example, how they could or couldn't become a platform for debate or holding their own exhibition or coming up with a contemporary art journal in Circa. And these similarities and differences are very important. Just to know what happened in the 70s, what happened in the 80s in different contexts. Artpool is an avant-garde archive in Eastern Europe that emerged from the late 70s and remains active today. Commencing in the 1979, Judit Klaniczay's role as the co-founder and leader of the Artpool can be understood in some sense as the continuation of his first institution project in Balatonboglár, which is a place at Lake Balaton in Hungary, about 150 kilometers southwest from Budapest, the capital. Here, Klaniczay's concept of an institution of an open artwork or an activist activity first appeared earlier in the 1970s. Klaniczay there organized a summer studio in a disused chapel for artists whose activities were restricted and monitored by the communist regime, and as such, pushed to the margins of culture and society because of their refusal of the ideological terms and conditions in culture imposed by the state. The 4 summers of its existence between 1970 and 1973 saw the emergence of a new concept, or context-based art practices, from mail art to experimental poetry, land art and action art, similar to the progressive art trends in Western Europe and in the US. The studio, however, at Balatonboglár became a center for officially proscribed avant-garde art as one of the cradles of cultural changes in Hungary, where Klaniczay was not only the organizer of these events, but also one of the participating artists and a self-appointed archivist. Saving letters, photos, leaflets, posters, and objects from the chapel studio, he started to arrange the documents that formed the beginning and is now the part of the significant collection of Artpool. Although Klaniczay's interest was never connected to direct political activism, the fact that the works exhibited in the chapel had not been selected by the official or by a official jury and were similar to the tendencies of works in Western Europe and the US, labeled as seditious and Klaniczay's work as dangerous. As a result, the police closed down the studio in 1973 and Klaniczay became a persona non grata in the cultural circles. He had no other opportunity for public appearance as organizer of events until 1979, although he remained active as an underground artist. In 1978, however, 2 events catalyzed the emergence of Artpool. The first was a trip to Amsterdam, where visits to specific collections of alternative culture strengthened Klaniczay's resolve to develop a similar creative practice in Hungary that would exist as a pool of information based on artistic exchanges. In the autumn of the same year, Klaniczay had a solo exhibition from his copper and brass woodwork objects and their imprints at the Fések Club in Budapest. After the vernissage, Klaniczay sent a bilingual poster of the exhibition to hundreds of addresses all over the world. that he had accumulated years before with the stamped request, "Please send me information about your activity." Surprisingly, more than 300 practitioners answered his call, or at least that's what he got, and the documents received became the part of the archive, which he set up soon after. Artpool then survived the years of state socialism through operating from their apartments between 1979 and 1992. Considered by the state as an oppositional activity and therefore monitored by the authorities, its development became defined by tactical considerations. Despite the general difficulties in traveling from eastern countries to the west, the Klaniczay actually managed to organize a couple of traveling projects. One was an Italian tour in 1979, and another one was Artpool's art tour through 6 countries of Europe in 1982, during which they could personally meet artists and collect materials by exchanging them for artworks and publications of Klaniczay and Artpool. In Hungary, the Klaniczays tried to attend every major exhibition, lectures and concerts to record and document them, although only very few people knew about the underground events and there was no video at the time. The general way of receiving information from abroad came through channels of mail art activities, although, as is known from secret police reports today, many postal communications would never arrive because of state-monitored control. Since state authorities prevented Klaniczay from receiving letters that were sent to the name Artpool, Klaniczay's response was to go as far as to change his name officially to Judit Bodor Artpool. In this way, he institutionalized his personal identity and made it difficult for the authorities not to allow him to receive mailings addressed to Artpool. Following this, another creative tactic employed by Klaniczay was to number each copy of every edition of Artpool's publication, so as they would be categorized as artworks and not as semi-stud publications. This then ensured that Klaniczay could circumvent strategies of censorship in relation to private publication. It was just an advantage that Klaniczay was also a graphic artist and knew how to make those publications that came to provide essential historical sources of the Hungarian avant-garde. In addition to documenting, collecting, and circulating information within the network, Artpool also organized exhibitions, events, and actions in temporary spaces called the Artpool Periodical Space, based upon the idea of the institution of permanent creation by French Fluxus artist Robert Filliou. During its 10 years of monitored operation, Artpool managed to expand its collections through exchange projects and accumulated several rare collections of international importance, like its collections of artists' stamp works, bookworks, and artist periodicals, and so on. When the state socialist regime in Hungary began to weaken in the 1980s, the archive had been receiving support from the Soros Foundation for 4 years, between 85 and 89. Further change came closer when in 87, when the introduction of laws concerning the operation of institutional foundations provided a framework for the rebirth of the Hungarian non-profit sector. Klaniczay and Klaniczay saw an opportunity within these legal changes to establish Artpool legally for the first time as a non-profit organization, which they were able to negotiate with the Budapest Municipal Council and open to the public finally. The Artpool Foundation was thus born in 1990 as a fully legal organization for the first time, and was followed in 1992 by the opening of a public institution named Artpool Art Research Center in the center of Budapest. This became the only institution in Hungary where the documents of progressive international and Hungarian art of the past 30 years can be researched. Since 1992, Artpool has organized more than 400 exhibitions, lectures, and other art events that relate to the specific research topic of the current year at the Research Center. As an example, between 1993 and 1996, Artpool has organized thematic projects on the most important movements of international avant-garde, like fluxus, performance art, and installation art, as well as around broader topics like context or the network. Based on thorough research in the collections of Artpool, these topics had been discussed and research had been disseminated in the form of exhibitions, meetings, performances, artist talks, videos, and slideshows. Since 2000, however, Artpool changed its approach. Having invited regular contributions over the years on topics largely within the context of art discourse, as I mentioned, Klaniczay decided to greet the 21st century by employing the specificity of each new year to make successive annual curation with concepts relating to number. For example, after the Year of Chance in 2001 to start the whole new century, it was the year of 2002, which on one hand related to the number 2, but on the other hand opened the concept to deal with, to advise the artist or to ask the artist to deal with concepts like twofoldness, doubles, doubt, and all the concepts that can relate to two or the in-between. Between 1992 and 1996, both the research and the events had taken place at Artpool Art Research Center. In 1997, other structural changes had happened. Artpool P60 exhibition space opened near the research center and became a space where the results of this research could be disseminated in one form. Around the same time, Artpool also created its virtual space, which you can see the address www.artpool.hu, which acts as another extended platform of dissemination using a bilingual Hungarian and English homepage of information, which contains the processed documents of past and present projects, descriptions, online publications, articles, texts, photos, bibliographies, chronologies, book and CD-ROM reviews, as well as links to other sites. Due to Klaniczay's correspondence project, Artpool is often referred to as a mail art archive with specific interest in Fluxus-related works, and Judit Bodor as the father of Hungarian mail art. Other than this, very often in Hungarian context, Klaniczay's and Artpool's projects are almost only discussed as political activism in relation to the activities prior to 1990, which, due to the involvement of and similarities to the progressive trends of the arts in Western Europe, naturally caused political scandal, which marginalized him and Artpool within the Hungarian cultural scene. However, as Pauline van Morik already pointed out in one of the texts about Artpool in 2003, we can find another possible reading of Artpool's correspondence project from Stefan Sterkun, who wrote that the ultra-democracy of the mail art movement preceded and was probably a part of a greater democratic uprisings in Eastern Europe. Not that many projects were overtly political, but for people in the Eastern Bloc countries, easy access to an international forum was a powerful antidote to the debilitating marginalization and internal state censorship. While it is true, therefore, that Klaniczay was best known in the network through the medium of correspondence art, he always refused an explicit political consciousness in his projects and considered himself more particularly as a researcher than an artist, so to speak, and aligned himself theoretically to the tradition of Duchamp or Robert Filiu or the Hungarian Lozserdény. He saw these as addressing not only linguistic or artistic problems, but also wider connections of culture. This to him was more important than being media-specific. He said, "Mail art has never been my primary interest. Art itself is what interests me. Mail art is interesting as a genre, as a fluxus activity, which brings about relationships between artists." Artpool as an institution thus became and remains both Klaniczay's artistic medium and work of art. This refers to the focal point of Klaniczay's interest, the duality of being a practitioner as well as an organizer of an activist institution, which receives, gives, and generates information by participating in a network of the avant-garde events. In the same time, Artpool archives these events, keeping the documentation alive and using them as possible ground for future works of art and future projects. An active archive, however, in consequence of being a specifically artistic activity, not only collects and archives that which already exists, but instead, through its project, generates further material susceptible also to archival processes. Over time, the accumulated documentation of its activities becomes the subject of art historical research through the archival process. An example of organizing information in a way that it becomes the part of historical research is the history of the exhibition Hungary Can Be Yours, originally in 1984, which is actually just reconstructed in the switch room that you can see, that was qualified by the authorities as anti-Soviet, irredentist, and opposed to Hungary's political system. Therefore, it was banned at the time. This exhibition later became significant as the last banned exhibition in Hungary, but also because it has its own history after the recontextualization of the original show. In December 1989, the exhibition had been reconstructed and accompanied by a roundtable discussion between former officials involved as censors and the artists they censored, and the catalogue of the exhibition had been published, that you can also see on the exhibition currently. The reason of the next reconstruction in 2001 was the accessibility of the secret police reports after the political changes. The opening of the files allowed the wider audience to see the original artworks, photos and video recordings taken at the opening, the report of the secret agent about the event, as well as the documents from the 1989 reconstruction, all in the context of the 1984 official country image. In the exhibition just now, you can see both the secret records and the agents writing about the exhibition, as well as the documents of the exhibition. In 2003, a new context was raised connected to a curatorial project which showed the exhibition as an example of socially engaged art projects from Eastern Europe to the Western audience in London in the Austrian Cultural Forum. Currently, the exhibition appears in the context of other examples from the archive as part of the I Confess I Was There project, representing an art practice concerning the relations between art, artists, place, location, memory and context. Recontextualization is therefore an important form of the archive as an art practice. It is the transfunctioned act which examines how a form or act, for example an exhibition or a performance, changes its meanings when it changes its form, thus becoming part of another context. And finally, the questions that now probably the most important for a lot of avant-garde archives and also for Artpool. Artpool's currently prominent positions demonstrates the extent to which the project has fulfilled so successfully and fully Klaniczay's original conception of the artwork as an institution. The outcome of this conception probably raises in itself the most difficult questions concerning Artpool's future itself. The furthest extension of this conclusion could be that after longevity, it has after all outlived the state socialist institutional framework it sought to interrogate. In effect, renders it institutional without perhaps having the capacity to sustain itself in this way as it is so conceptually and contextually fused with and as the art practice of Klaniczay. Institutions usually sustain their discourse through depersonalization, where individuals contribute to the running of the institution along lines already laid out. The institution can therefore perpetuate its existence over successive lifetimes and generations. How will Artpool as a coherent artwork of Judit Klaniczay be understood in the current and future context of institutional framework in which it will have to participate? Although for Klaniczay the most important thing as an active archive is the organization of information, which is the meta-activity of relation building and creating the potential for constructing alternative histories, Artpool as an institution has to face problems similar to many other archives that collects and documents the avant-garde. How will it manage to maintain the institution in the future? What financial sources are available for funding? And how could this archive become recognized as an important part of the artwork? Lacking recognition as cultural heritage, the only option at present seems to survive. then either sell the archive to a museum collection so as to become a part of a bigger archival collection. Like, for example, in the UK, I think just recently, the Artist Placement Group's archive is going to be the part of the Tate Modern. Or to keep them together as closed private collections after the owner dies, which then gives the potential to be sold partially later on and have money. In both cases, the danger is that the avant-garde art archive as autonomous and alternative form of art institution might disappear. The reason this is unthinkable is because archives such as Artpool had and has an additional function. These were and these are the only places which preserve information and documentation about progressive and new art forms which were different from the ruling socialist realist art or from the ruling mainstream art. As Zdenka Badovinac, director of Galeria Moderna Ljubljana in Slovenia, called these spaces as interrupted histories, we can say that these spaces' role today is to help opening up questions about art and its possible histories. Artpool is a paradigm of such an institution. Thank you.